Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 43 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Ottawa Senators, in which the Sharks have lost 5-4. Coming into today's game, it really felt as though the Sharks would have a decent chance of being able to win this one for a couple of reasons. The first of which, of course, the Sharks were just coming off of a win against the Montreal Canadiens a couple of days ago, a win that ended a 12-game regulation losing streak for themselves, so they have the excitement, they have the momentum coming into this one. But on top of that, the Sharks were going up against a team who is not necessarily as bad as the Sharks, who of course are dead last in the league, but are not necessarily all that much better than them either, finding themselves coming into the day third last in the league, just a few points ahead of San Jose. So it felt as though that this was going to end up being a semi-competitive performance tonight for San Jose, and if you take a look at the scoreboard, you would think that that's indeed how it happened out. A 5-4 lead, a 5-4 win, which is a one-goal game, would indicate a close back-and-forth performance between these two teams, but that wasn't really the case. While the Sharks had moments here tonight where they looked decent, it felt as though it was Senators controlled for a good 45 minutes of this 60-minute game. And it started off exactly like that in the first period. The Sharks completely asleep at the wheel with multiple just surprising mistakes, like not just like general defensive errors, which this game was chock full of, but just awkward plays like Tomas Hertl skating into a broken stick on the ice and as such giving the puck away, which eventually leads to the Senators' first goal, or Mackenzie Blackwood giving the puck away behind the net a couple of times, leading to two extremely close calls, 4 goals against. Just really odd plays that really showed that perhaps because it was a road game in the afternoon and things of that nature, that just felt as though the Sharks were not ready to play, and so they gave up the first 2 goals of this one. The Duclair goal was a bit of a wake-up call for the team as they cut the lead in half and began to start closing that previously lopsided shot gap between these two teams. And while they would not manage to score another goal in the first, it felt more safe heading into the second period and that the Sharks could actually make this an interesting game. And at the beginning of the second, that's exactly what happens. Not only do they get the game-tying goal from Marc-Edouard Vlasic, but they get the go-ahead goal as well from Kevin Labanc, 2 unlikely scores for the San Jose Sharks that give them the lead in this one. But while the Duclair goal was a wake-up call for San Jose, the Labanc goal was a bit of like a snooze button for them at the same time, as at that point the Sharks just completely fall back off and the Senators are allowed to get the go-ahead, the game-tying goal for themselves and the go-ahead goal still in the second period to take a 4-3 lead heading into the third. To put it into perspective, the Sharks would score 2 goals in that second period on the only 2 shots on goal that they would have. Otherwise, it was entirely Ottawa-controlled. In the third period, the Sharks at the very least would manage to keep it close, not give up another goal to Ottawa, and they would eventually manage to get a game-tying goal again for themselves from Filip Zadina with just a few minutes left, and it looked like we would then be destined for an overtime performance between these two teams. But I don't know if this was bad luck or truly just a coaching decision, but in the last minute of this game, the Sharks end up with Mike Hoffman, Luke Kunin, and Justin Bailey on the ice against some of the Senators' top forwards and just offensive players, and as you would expect in that type of matchup, the Sharks are completely hemmed into their own zone, and you could just tell a goal was coming in this situation. While it did take to the last few seconds, Tarasenko, with 4 seconds remaining, would get the go-ahead goal to finish this one off in regulation. A disappointing finish to a game in which the Sharks looked like they'd be able to get at the very least 1 point out of. So again, I don't know if this was just bad luck in terms of how a line change ended up, but it really felt as though the Sharks shot themselves in the foot with their personnel choices at the end of this one and why they indeed lost it in regulation. Having said all that, this was not a particularly impressive performance from either of these two teams. It's quite clear that these are 2 of the worst teams in the NHL with some of the awful defensive errors coming out of them. We take a look at the Vlasic goal. There's no way Vlasic should be able to win a race up the ice against anybody in the NHL as one of the slower players in the entire league, and yet it happens. Kevin Labanc is left completely uncovered because like 4 different Senators players go to try and cover Mario Ferraro, who is holding the puck, and then immediately after that, on the Tkachuk goal, we see Batherson beat Duclair, his man, defensively, and then both Eklund and Granlund activate to cover him, leading leaving Tkachuk all alone as well. So clearly neither of these two teams are particularly good. That's why they find themselves right at the bottom of the standings, but it is the Senators who just barely edged it out in the end, and realistically, they definitely deserved it. Moving on to the players to talk about, because the Sharks were victorious a couple of games ago, or a couple of nights ago, against the Montreal Canadiens, David Quinn, seemingly having found something that works at least in the very, very, very short term, decides to go with the same exact lineup here tonight. Can't really blame him for that decision. And so the top line is Zetterlund, Hertl, and Zadina. Now, the good news, this line does manage to score a goal that ended up being the game-tying goal, which really looked like it was going to force overtime until, of course, those last few seconds did occur. But besides that, this was not a very effective line for San Jose, which was slightly disappointing to see. Zetterlund, probably one of his worst games that we have seen in a while, was quite invisible, I felt, here tonight. Outside of a decent chance, or a pretty good chance, I should say, on a power play, at 5-on-5, he really didn't do much of anything. Zadina, quite similar. Outside of the goal that he did score, you didn't really notice him all that much. And Hertl, who is supposed to be, as I mentioned earlier on, the Sharks' best player in the lineup at this point, maybe like somewhat competitive with Granlund, but even above him for sure, was not a great outing for Hertl either, as he was making some relatively uncharacteristic mistakes. As I mentioned, him skating into a broken stick is both unlucky, but at the same time, extremely sort of unaware for Hertl in that situation. And so generally, it was just not a very good game for any of these first liners. Moving on to the second line, we have Eklund, Granlund, and Duclair. It was a bit of a weird one because at their height, this line probably had the best chances for the San Jose Sharks. Eklund had a beautiful play up at the blue line. He will not end up with an assist on this goal, which is the Vlasic one, as he ends up being the third man to touch this puck, or the fourth man, I guess, technically, to touch this puck. But he really was the one to make the play happen, fighting with Chukrin, winning that battle, allowing for this chance. So that was very good. He also had a great opportunity where he shoots this puck through his legs, which forces Korpisalo to make a really, really nice saves. Duclair also a few very, very strong offensive zone shifts. But then at the same time, it felt as though like 80% of the time in this one, these three players found themselves defending and not defending particularly well. Eklund was making some pretty poor decisions in the defensive zone, not reading plays exceptionally well. Duclair looked slow and not particularly engaged defensively either. And Granlund not doing a great job as being that third man back as the center of this line. And so all in all, it's hard to really evaluate whether or not this line was more positive or negative for the San Jose Sharks, because the offensive chances are likely outweighed by the defensive errors, but I would say generally probably not their best outing. When it comes to the third line, we have Barabanov, Cunnin, and Bailey, and you would expect me to just talk about this third line very briefly and say, wow, they were terrible, they did nothing. But actually, from a more consistent level, this third line was perhaps the Sharks' best line of the night. Not exactly generating tons of great offensive chances where you're like, wow, these three players were so good. But in terms of actually just getting offensive zone time, which for a bottom six line is really what you are hoping for, these three players did a very good job. And right at the top of that list, I would have to say, is Barabanov, who probably had his best game of the season. It's not saying much, but it is saying something. He did get a primary assist on the Duclair goal, so it's nice to see him get rewarded for that with a point. But besides that, even, he was pretty effective for San Jose. He was keeping the puck in possession for the team. He was making some decent passes. He was finally driving this line forward, which is something that we have been waiting for him to be able to do for pretty much the entirety of this season. And so I thought Barabanov had a really solid game. When it comes to Luke Cunnin, it is to a slightly lesser extent, but I thought he was a pretty decent complement to Barabanov in the offensive zone, doing a decent job at keeping pucks alive along the boards, which is something that we have not seen from Cunnin pretty much the entirety of this year. Usually, he's not involved in the forechecking effort, or when he is involved in the forechecking effort, it's not a very good effort from him. But here tonight, he was making things actually happen, and that definitely was a decent part of why this third line was effective. When it comes to Justin Bailey, he had a bit more of a hit or miss game. While I do think he was still playing a decent part of this third line offensively, from a defensive standpoint, Bailey definitely did struggle, and he ends up making the major mistake that leads to the Tarasenko goal right at the end of this game, because he gets pushed by Tarasenko in front of the net and loses his balance. It's hard to necessarily blame him because it's not exactly like a positioning error or anything like that. It's more just like a gaffe, a mistake type of moment, but still it's something to be critical of, where he gets out-muscled, so to speak, from Tarasenko, loses his balance and crashes into his own goaltender, which prevents Blackwood from even being able to attempt to make the save on the Tarasenko shot. It gets reviewed for goal interference, but I was not surprised to see this goal end up standing, because in any normal case, if Bailey was able to actually hold his ground, he doesn't go crashing into Blackwood, and Blackwood is able to make that save. Tarasenko is, allowed to be able to try and take that ice, considering it's not in the crease or anything like that. And so, but because Bailey loses his balance, it ends up being in the back of the net, and a tough break for sure for him, and other errors defensively as well in the earlier parts of this game, but at least offensively he was decent enough. So I don't know if David Quinn is going to be too hard on him. When it comes to the fourth line, nice to see Kevin Labanc score, of course, his second of the season, but otherwise this fourth line didn't really do a ton. Carpenter continues to just be practically invisible for the San Jose Sharks. He's just been entirely not doing anything for this team. We wait with bated breath for the return of either Nico Sturm or Logan Couture to the lineup, which seem to be things happening sooner rather than later, so that Carpenter will almost certainly at that point be the odd man out, because he's just providing zero for the San Jose Sharks. At least Labanc and Hoffman had a couple of moments offensively. Of course, Labanc with his goal, Hoffman a decent couple of plays, but from a defensive standpoint, not great, and generally I wouldn't be super impressed with the fourth line either. When it comes to defensively, it was a bit of a weird game, especially for this top pairing of Ferraro and Vlasic. Now, this top pairing was really good in the previous game against the Montreal Canadiens, was able to prevent themselves from getting too hemmed into their own zone in that one. Not the case here tonight, as they ended up being caught on the ice for multiple extended defensive zone shifts. They were the defensive pairing that was on the ice for the last minute of this game that leads to this Tarasenko goal. And while I won't put the blame on them, as I already talked about it extensively with the Bailey situation, it's still a note that they are unable to really make that effort to get the puck out. From an offensive standpoint, though, they actually did rather well. Not only does Vlasic score his first goal of the season off of that nice sort of joining the play late type of situation on that 2-on-1 to get that goal, but Ferraro ends up with 3 assists, the second time this season that such a thing has happened. And so from an offensive standpoint, they did look pretty good, but there were just one too many shifts where they found themselves defending and not doing it particularly well. On the second pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda, and I do want to mention for sure, when it comes to Henry Thrun, he was perhaps the Sharks' best all-around defenseman on the night. I was very impressed with the calmness of Thrun's game and the use of his stick tonight as well. I counted at least half a dozen times that Thrun had a great stick positioning that either got in the way of a shot, forced it out of play, getting the whistle, or got in the way of a pass, forcing it out of play or just away from danger. It was an extremely impressive game positionally from Henry Thrun. Not perfect by any means, kind of like what I said when it comes to his Montreal performance a couple of days ago, but still really good. And as I mentioned, because of the issues that both Ferraro and Vlasic had in the defensive zone, I would say Thrun indeed was the best defenseman for the Sharks tonight, and Ruda was really not all that far behind. I don't think he was as sharp as Thrun, but pretty close to it for sure. Then we have the third defensive pairing, and I was pretty praise heavy of these two players in the previous game. I mentioned that Addison looked quite good, Ohatyuk not too bad himself, but that dream has essentially died here tonight, as they were not nearly as good on the night, found themselves defending quite poorly in their own zone. Some really bad giveaways as well in terms of breaking that puck out of the zone, like that first pass into the neutral zone, just always seemed to lead to a turnover going back the other way, which is not what you want to see, especially when they're not so heavily pressured, right? It's one thing to not be able to clear the zone if you're Ferraro and Vlasic when you're under tons and tons of offensive pressure, but when you're pretty much left alone to be able to drop a pass and you still end up giving it away, that is like 10 times worse, and it felt as though that happened multiple times to both of these players. And so just not a great night for either of them. And then finally we have the goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood. He had a few really good saves here tonight. Don't get me wrong. I will not say that he was the primary reason for why the Sharks ended up losing this game. I don't think because he just lets in 5 goals and the Sharks managed to score 4 that it's entirely on him. At the same time though, it's hard to necessarily praise him a ton for the performance because indeed 5 goals against. Didn't have a chance on the Tarasenko one. Didn't have a chance on the Tkachuk one. Didn't really have a chance on, I believe, the Giroux one either, but a couple of them he perhaps could have been able to have and could have technically been the difference maker with a slightly better night. So generally it feels as though he just joins the rest of the Sharks players as being somewhat average to below average. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday for what will end up being perhaps, I believe, one of the earliest games that the Sharks will play this entire season. Definitely going to be one that the Sharks, if they were not ready to play this one because a bit too sleepy, they almost certainly will not be ready to play the next one against the Buffalo Sabres, but maybe they'll be able to have their coffee early on enough to actually put up a relatively solid performance. Class dismissed.